Good morning, everyone. As Senior Director of the Atlantic Council in Turkey and Turkey Program Center, I'm delighted to be officially launching the Defense Journal, an initiative we started last year to explore the full spectrum of defense issues involving primarily the United States and Turkey, as well as the region, covering many different aspects of the defense industry. After a decade of deepening mutual disappointments, the tenor of the U.S.-Turkey bilateral relationship shifted in the aftermath of Russia's February 2022 offensive war against Ukraine. The war has recentered Western security priorities on NATO and hard power, leading to renewed interest moving beyond the grievances of recent years in order to better leverage Turkey's military and diplomatic clout. In the formative years of U.S.-Turkey bilateral relations, defense ties acted as a backbone in the relationship, but more recently, they have come under strain. Taking into account global developments, increasing multipolarity and uncertainty, we believe the time is right to revisit the relationship and brainstorm to find areas for cooperation. We envision the Defense Journal as a venue for frank and honest exchanges between American, Turkish, and regional strategic communities. Our contributors will not always agree, but most importantly, we will keep the strategic dialogue active and running. The exchange will, we hope, have value in informing and enabling enhanced understanding between Ankara and Washington, D.C., as well as with all NATO alliance capitals. With this opportunity, I would like to thank the Defense Journal co-managing editors, Rich Alston and John Kasapoğlu, who are with us in Washington, D.C. today. Thank you for their terrific work. I also would like to thank my Turkey team, both in Istanbul and in Washington, D.C., for their efforts in accomplishing this important mission. I would like to thank our Honorary Advisory Board, General Wesley Clark, who we will be hearing from shortly, and Ambassador Doug Lute as well. Now it is my pleasure to introduce General James Jones for his remarks. General Jones is the Executive Chairman Emeritus at the Atlantic Council and former National Security Advisor to President Obama. General Jones, thank you much for participating today, and the floor is yours. Thanks much.
Thank you, Daphne. It's a pleasure to be joining you virtually today for this important and very timely discussion on the U.S.-Turkey defense relationships. I learned early in my career about just how vitally important a role Turkey plays and the leverage it offers to not only the United States, but the entire North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Bordering on tangential to many of the globe's most pressing hotspots, including Syria, Iraq, and across the Black Sea, Ukraine, I can't think of many countries more strategically located on the planet. Turkey has always been a linchpin between East and West, which, dating back to the Cold War, has added to the value it's brought to the NATO alliance beyond its troop count, which amounts to the second highest in NATO. In recent years, the U.S.-Turkey relationship has become increasingly contentious and, frankly, very challenging. In fact, the defense relationship, which always served as one of the most important pillars of the bilateral relations since Turkey joined NATO in 1952, has been hindered by disagreements on Syria and Turkey's purchase of the Russian S-400 missile system, which led to its removal from the F-35 program and the imposition of the CAATSA sanctions. But it seems to me now is the right time to revisit the relationship, and that's why I look forward to this discussion today. The Defense Journal by Atlantic Council in Turkey plays a critical role to advance the discussion and debate through an independent platform highlighting perspectives from both sides of the Atlantic across a range of issues from geopolitical to operational and industrial affairs. And despite all of the challenges, the United States and Turkey continue to offer ample opportunities of strategic collaboration around the region and commercial opportunities in the private sector. We are well past the time to explore new avenues for cooperation. As Daphne mentioned, this launch is just the beginning, and I greatly look forward to the future of this project. So with that, I'll pass the floor back to Daphne. And Daphne, thank you very much for inviting me to make a few remarks.
Thank you, General Jones. Now, I'm very happy to introduce General Wesley Clark. General Clark is an honorary board member of the Defense Journal and the board director at the Atlantic Council. General Clark is a former NATO Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. General Clark, we are so glad to have you. The floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much, Daphne, and I'm delighted to be joining you today, although virtually. I wish I could have been there in person, and I hope I'll be able to make it in person the next time. I'm very excited to be part of this project as an honorary board member for the Defense Journal by the Atlantic Council in Turkey. When Atlantic Council President and CEO Fred Kemp asked me 6 months ago if I'd be interested in participating, I gave him a wholehearted yes. I've seen Turkish-U.S. relations back into the late 70s. I was a major working for General Alexander Haig at that time, and we went to Land Southeast, which had an American commander, General Sam Walker, changed command. I studied Turkey. I learned it then. We had wonderful Turkish generals with us in NATO at SHAPE. I was a major, and I did my best to communicate with them. Of course, they didn't speak English then. It was just really the beginning, but they were strong, they were determined, and they were upright men, and I greatly admired their military professionalism. Look, in recent years, as General Jones said, we've seen our relationship jeopardized by politics and the regional environment. And that's why I feel the Defense Journal has an important role to play in reminding communities across continents about the strategic value and the importance of the relationship. There's been a marked lack of dialogue and exchange between the defense communities in recent years, and I hope this discussion today and future issues and events around the Defense Journal help rebuild these bridges. Turkey has so much to offer. I'm such an admirer of Turkish engineering, Turkish professionalism. Spoken to Mr. Bayraktar about his drones. There's so much Turkey has to offer, and we've just got to get this relationship rebuilt. So I was pleased to contribute to the second latest issue of the Defense Journal through an interview with Rich Otson, the moderator of our upcoming panel today. We covered my experiences dealing with Turkey, and then first as a young major, and then 18 years later as Supreme Allied Commander. But you know what I found was the Turkish approach was always consistent. They valued clarity, foresight, execution. Say what you're going to do and do it. When we would come to an understanding and work together in the same spirit, we were extremely effective. They've always had deep concerns about national security, their security in the region, and it's very understandable given the volatility of that neighborhood. So I think this is a really important initiative. I'm delighted to be part of it, and thank you for inviting me to be with the event. With that, it's my pleasure to turn the floor back to our moderator now, Rich Otson. Let's kick off the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General Clark, and also to General Jones for your comments. Before we get underway, I want to mention a few items of housekeeping. First of all, this discussion is public and on the record. Secondly, at the end of the panel, we will address questions from the audience. We may address some during the remarks where it's appropriate. But we strongly encourage you to begin submitting your questions now. I see we already have a couple. To ask a question, please visit askac.org, choose our event, and write your questions along with your name, title, and affiliation. Anonymous questions are unlikely to be answered. We encourage you to engage with us on social media using the handles @AC_Istanbul and @Atlantic Council. We also invite you to check out this second and latest issue of the Defense Journal, which debuted today. For those of you with us in person in Washington, you can see that there's a QR code in the graphics over on the wall. You can scan the QR code and it will bring up the issue. For those of you online, our team will be dropping the link into the Zoom momentarily. I'm very, very honored here to be with three colleagues whom I've had the pleasure of getting to know as three of the deepest experts on this bilateral relationship. Their bios, I believe, are on the page. I'm just going to introduce them very briefly. We have Dov Zakheim, who's a longtime U.S. national security official and policy influencer in Washington, D.C., who has literally decades of watching the ups and the downs, the vicissitudes of the relationship. We've got Can Kasapoğlu, who's a strategic analyst for EDAM, a leading Turkish think tank, also a fellow at the Hudson Institute here in Washington, D.C., and a prolific author, perhaps the most prolific and most recognized on Turkish defense industrial matters, especially drones. Joining us on screen, we have Ambassador Alper Coşkun, a retired Turkish diplomat now working for the Carnegie Endowment for World Peace. Gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to have all three of you here.
Thank you. Thank you.
If I can start with you, Dov. As a foreign and security policy shaper since the Reagan years, you have a unique perspective from Washington on how this bilateral relationship has evolved. Turkey has become a richer and more capable ally, but also a far more independent and challenging one at the same time. Can you talk a little about the evolution of Washington's views on the relationship over that period, and how well has the view in Washington kept up with realities?
Well, I've been around a long time. That's true enough. Look at my hair, whatever's left of it. I first came to work with Turkey in 1981, so Wes Clark is a couple of years ahead of me. I was a special assistant to an assistant secretary, Richard Pearl, and together we started the High-Level Defense Group, which still operates. And I remember then, and during the 80s really, Turkey was seen as a very, very valuable ally. It was the height of the Cold War. They bordered the Soviet Union. You looked at Turkish troops. These were tough guys. And these were folks, there weren't any women then. These were folks that we knew would deter Russia, or the Soviet Union as it was, from trying anything in NATO's south. So that's number one. Number two, we had an excellent relationship with these people, person to person. I think Wes talked about that. Yeah. There was a comfort level, a degree of trust that you can't really express it in words. You feel it, and we felt it. What then happened? It took time. I think the first thing that happened was the end of the Cold War. All of a sudden, Turkey wasn't the front line anymore in the sense that it had been. I mean, after all, we had a new relationship with Russia, with a very different kind of Russia. It wasn't the Soviet Union. That, I think, created in the minds of some in Washington, well, they just didn't need Turkey as much. Big mistake for a couple of reasons. The first is geography never changes. As Wes and Jim both said, Turkey is in the middle of a very vital area. You look east, you've got Syria, you've got Iraq, you've got Iran. You look south, you've got Israel. You look west, of course, you've got NATO. You look north, and you have the Caucasus, and look at all the trouble the Russians have had in the Caucasus. So to just walk away mentally, it wasn't, materially, it was mental. Huge mistake. Yeah. Then you had a growing focus on human rights, on locking up journalists, what have you. And remember, if you lock up one journalist, the entire media community goes after you. That's all they think about. I can understand it, colleague. But nevertheless, I'm thinking today, Mr. Biden, who has talked a lot about the authoritarianism versus democracy, condemned people who violate human rights. Look who he's welcoming in the White House, with fanfare, with private dinners. And I'm all for it, because our relationship with India and with Mr. Modi is critical. Mm-hmm. But there does seem to be a kind of difference here between the way we're treating India and literally the pomp and circumstance which Mr. Modi deserves, and the way we've been treating Mr. Erdogan.
So a bit of a double standard, perhaps.
A bit of a double standard, you might say. Now, as we've already heard, the attack on Ukraine, the invasion, all of a sudden everybody's waking up to see, guess what? Turkey's important. We forget, of course, that There were 2 Crimean Wars, pretty much similar in many ways. Allies coming in to stop the Russians from taking over the Black Sea. Sound familiar? I think that there is a huge prospect for rethinking that relationship, as you've already heard. I think this defense journal is going to be a critical element of that, by the way, because it'll reach the Washington community and beyond the Washington community. And so I'm a board member of the Atlantic Council, so I guess I have a piece of this, but I'll still praise the Atlantic Council for it. It is the right time to do this. And we were just talking just before we started. Look what the Turkish Central Bank did today. Raised interest rates to 15%. All of a sudden, economists are saying Turkey's looking at things economically differently. Yeah. So you now see a Turkey that's working with Israel, a Turkey that's working with Egypt, a Turkey that's dealing with its economy differently, a Turkey that hasn't minded sending drones to the Ukrainians to knock out Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers. This is a Turkey that we should pay a lot more attention to.
That's right. And Turkey actually has been giving lethal aid to the Ukrainians for several years, since 2017, I believe, well before the Western community was ready to. So thanks for pointing out those opportunity stuff. John, if I can turn to you, a lot of those opportunities stem from Turkey's burgeoning defense industry and what that means for U.S. interests and other U.S. partners. Can you describe the Turkish defense industry export network for us a little bit? How broad is the suite of products and technologies? How does Turkish decision-making on defense exports and partnerships work? And what are the pillars for joint research, production, or sales with other countries? Who are they cooperating and collaborating with? And how is that reshaping Turkish foreign policy?
Thank you, Rich. Well, as for starters, I should emphasize for the audience watching us here and online that what they're going to hear from me as the words of an expert who criticized Turkish procurement of the S-400, but also praised the Turkish drone warfare program. We know that with the political division in the Turkish landscape right now, scientific and critical thinking is taking a backseat, but what they're going to hear is the very antithesis of that. Let's take a virtual shopping cart and let's have like an online arms shopping in the Turkish defense market. You can buy the best drones in terms of warfighting quality and what you're going to pay as the price tag. It is not only Bayraktar TB2s. Right now they are working on transonic unmanned aircraft like Kızıl Elma. We have a strategic drone from Baykar, Akıncı. TUSAŞ is yet another one. They are coming up with really good solutions, and they are combat-proven solutions. But if you want to add that shopping cart, a main battle tank, which is a century-old weapon system, you cannot, simply. A 4th generation or 3rd generation combat aircraft, also you cannot. So that shows the magnitude and the outlook of Turkish defense industry. You can buy drones from Turkey, including the software, command control systems and everything, interfaces of weapon systems and smart weapons, smart munitions for those drones, but you cannot shop for a main battle tank because Turkey has been on the losing side of the industrial revolution and now surfing, if you like, on the waves of the new era. What we mean by that, we mean robotic warfare, drone warfare systems, smart systems, human-machine teaming. For instance, as I'm talking right now, in NATO drills, Turkish unmanned surface combatants, in civilian terms, naval drones, are hunting for submarines in NATO exercises. So they carry sonobuoys, or they carry magnetic anomaly detectors, and they also cross-domain with unmanned aerial systems that we are talking about. So this is the first trend to understand that Turkey is showing 2 different paradigms in terms of the technological breakthrough all the way from 20th century to 21st century. The second thing is 2 decades ago, had we organized this meeting in this very venue, we would have been talking about a net arms importer. Yeah. It was a hungry arms importer because to the Western community, Turkey, to make it really understandable, Turkey was bordering Iran, Iraq, Syria, as my colleague said, but let's make it more flashy, more punchy. Like Turkey was bordering Hafez al-Assad, Saddam Hussein, and Khomeini at the same time. Nothing better can be asked for as for your neighbors. And when doing that, Turkish army was tying down more than 20 Soviet divisions. And that Soviet Union was not recognizing the territorial unity of Turkey, including the Bosphorus and the Straits. So that we are talking about, that was an importer, really hungry importer of arms. Within 2 decades, that nation has turned into an arms exporter. With $4 billion of arms export volume right now we are talking about. And those arms, in some theaters, they are game changers. Look at the Second Karabakh War, for instance. It was a Russian-architected frozen conflict, and it is not because of the Israeli and Turkish, to underline that, Israeli and Turkish intervention supporting Azerbaijan.
So you're saying that, if I can,
Sure, please.
the paradigm of Turkey as importer, U.S. as exporter, and the main question being, how much of what they want do we give them? This is a new paradigm now. The question is, they produce a lot on their own. There are some things that we can collaborate in and that they might need from us, or even vice versa in some places. And the right question is, where can we collaborate?
That's the million-dollar question. Actually, yes, we can collaborate, but Turkey still depends on its Western partners and allies for defense technology generation. Anti-ballistic missile systems, for instance. Definitely the Turkish-American and Turkish-French cooperation is really important. Turkey is right now enjoying its mini aircraft carrier, which is going to use as a drone carrier, and that is the product of the Turkish-Spanish defense cooperation. The ship is based on the Juan Carlos I baseline. The most important thing here is Turkish defense needs from its allies are becoming more refined, first. Second thing, look at the most important trade partners, defense trade partners of Turkey. Israel back in the 90s, South Korea still, and Ukraine. What is the common thing of all these three nations? Co-production deals, technology transfer, and not asking too much questions as to where you're going to use that weapon systems. It is, like very upside down on how you're going to do defense business with the Germans. Ukraine we're going to talk about, but that very point that Turkey has been on the losing side of the industrial age, but on the winning side of the new era, information superiority-driven era, I think that also defines Turkish-Ukrainian defense ties, which we're going to talk about. Turkey is coming up with like drone systems, but the aerial engines are coming from Ukraine. So that speaks for itself. That speaks volumes.
A key producer, but one that needs partners.
Sure.
If I can turn to Ambassador Coşkun, good to have you, Alper. Thank you. Luckily, one of the first questions coincides with one I had planned to ask you. You are an astute observer of the Atlantic Alliance and of relationships between Turkey and European as well as the European countries as well as the United States. The big news in transatlantic relations these days, at least from Washington's perspective, is NATO accession for Sweden. So what would constitute, in your view, sufficient progress by Sweden in terms of implementing their new laws against supporting designated terror groups? What will be enough for Ankara to greenlight Swedish accession into NATO?
Rich, thank you. It's great to be with all of you. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity. Two things about that first, because this has turned into a very polluted debate, I think. One is it's important to recognize that, historically speaking, Turkey and Sweden have a positive legacy in terms of bilateral relations. That has not changed despite their continuing disagreement, if you will, vis-a-vis Sweden's entry into NATO. And that is not about the premise of the idea, but more about certain expectations on Turkey's part. Second, when you look at the map, Finland joining NATO, Sweden following suit, they all correspond to Turkey's strategic interest. I think these are 2 points that need to be borne in mind. Now, coming to your question, the specifics of that, we can see the benchmarks that we can look at are in the trilateral memorandum that Turkey, Finland, and Sweden signed. Finland has passed that threshold as far as Turkey is concerned, and Sweden is yet to do so. And there, when we look at the details, there are two main elements. One had to do with certain constraints that Turkey believed were being imposed on Sweden's defense industry export items. Sweden argues that that has been taken care of, and I believe that is an issue that both sides can agree has been solved more or less. But there's more, as far as Ankara is concerned, room for improvement on the second count, which has to do with curtailing the activities of terrorist organizations as Turkey sees them and are, as they are also internationally recognized in Sweden, particularly the PKK. And then we have the FETÖ terror organization, as Turkey refers to the instigators of the 2016 coup attempt. Now, I believe there was a recent meeting that took place between the parties. The messages coming out of that meeting were positive, but then we did hear President Erdogan recently stating that Turkey continues to have expectations. I think we'll see this debate continue until the Vilnius summit. As far as the general premise is concerned, as I said, I think Turkey has an interest in ensuring that Sweden joins the alliance, but it has continuing expectations from Sweden. And I think we also need to take a step back because there's also a broader picture here. Though the issues aren't linked, Turkey is expecting the delivery or the confirmation of an approval of its request to buy F-16s from the United States. These issues aren't linked. The United States particularly makes that point, though Congress has suggested otherwise. So there's a broader picture here, and I think we can expect this negotiation to continue up until the Vilnius summit, where I hope that all of the parties will come out with a successful result, and Sweden will be able to will be able to join NATO with Turkey's green light.
So it sounds like an era of moderate optimism there.
I'm an optimist by definition, and I believe because of the fact that Turkey has an interest in Sweden joining NATO, I think that the path is open for a positive expectation.
Excellent, thank you. Dov, turning back to the perspective from Washington, some voices in Washington seem to see the growing capabilities in Turkish defense industry as unsettling or even threatening. Defense industrial cooperation of the 1990s variety, as we said, where we produce and Turkey buys, has certainly attenuated. Is there a sweet spot? Can we thread this needle by finding ways to leverage in the joint interest these burgeoning capabilities without threatening either interest in Washington or our other neighbors in the region?
Well, absolutely, and it's precisely as you said, because where Turkey now is developing a comparative advantage is going beyond conventional sorts of weapons like aircraft and tanks. I mean, it is working in AI. It is working on drones of all kinds. It's that sort of thing. And there, we have a problem at our end. We have difficulty in bringing in the commercial sector into the military sector. There's been legislation to make that happen. There's been Defense Department initiatives to make it happen, but it hasn't happened quickly enough or widely enough. Well, to me, that sounds like a sweet spot, because clearly if we can work together with Turkey, or Turkey as it should be pronounced, I think, I hope I'm getting it right, then that opens the door not just for the cooperation between the two countries, but for better exploitation of the civilian cutting-edge technologies that are critical for our defense capability in the future. So, yes, I think the answer is we can cooperate. As you said, we've seen drones operating quite well that have been built in Turkey that incorporate other countries' systems within those drones. What a perfect opportunity for us. So I think the answer definitely is yes.
Great, thank you. So, John, let's talk about Ukraine specifically. And Turkey and Ukraine, as we mentioned, have been defense partners. How far back does the collaboration go? How committed is Turkey to Ukraine's survival? And what would you see as the Turkish role getting beyond that narrow defense cooperation in conflict termination and setting post-war arrangements?
Well, I always tend to describe Turkish procurement of the S-400 from the Russian Federation as a crazy night out, a date out. But the Turkish-Ukrainian defense relations are a marriage of convenience at their best. First of all, Turkey, again, as I said, like Turkey is coming with the advantages of the 21st century defense industrial paradigm. Drones, interfaces between drones and munitions. We are talking about like smart munitions. Right now we are talking about, I'm gonna come to that upon your questions following, drones releasing loitering munitions. And those loitering munitions also have their electro-optic sensors. So like drone is being a center of a network-centric operation based on information superiority and kinetic strikes, and also like boosting other phases of the operations from artillery. So Turkey is coming with that. Ukraine inherited the best of the late Soviet era especially in terms of aerospace engines. So combining that, the aerial engines know-how of Ukraine and the Turkish drone warfare efforts, what comes out is, for instance, is the transonic aircraft project of Turkey. What comes out is like the first Turkish strategic drone, Akıncı, the Raider, that can operate in the ceiling of 40,000 feet. That can be equipped, both weapons can be equipped with JDAMs, cruise missiles, air-to-air missiles. So we might see in the future some aerial kills as well. But more importantly, Turkey and Ukraine are building a joint defense industrial and technological base at Russia's doorstep. This is one of the most important geopolitical developments in the post-Soviet space. And the war showed one thing. Turkey decided to, Baykar specifically decided to establish a drone plant near Kyiv. And the Russians did not like that. Then the war started. And the Russians threatened to hit that drone plant to deter Turkey and the company Baykar, as well as the Ukrainian government, to establish that. They did not back off. So in the forthcoming years, you're going to see Turkish drones being produced on the Ukrainian soil with cooperation between the Ukrainian and Turkish engineers. And that happens before Ukraine becomes a NATO member. So this is really important. While again, like it is, the drones are taking the headlines, making it to the headlines right now, we shouldn't forget the very fact that Ukraine practically lost its navy following the illegal annexation of Crimea. We are talking about like the 70% of the Ukrainian naval capability.
They need frigates and fast boats.
Gone by the wind in Crimea. Yeah. So Turkey is also cooperating with Ukraine in that. And Ukraine gonna soon operate Turkish Milgem class indigenous corvettes. And again, like this is the beauty of these relations. Ukraine is not an off-the-shelf buyer of Turkish solutions. Ukraine is co-producing those vessels. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, 2 platforms of the same baseline will be produced after the war, hopefully, in the Ukrainian dockyards. But this is something, and that happened, again, when Turkey was procuring the S-400. Those deals were sealed and cut when Turkey was, again, like procuring the S-400 from the Russian Federation, which shows, the frenemy character of the Turkish-Russian relations, but also the freedom of space that the Turkish defense diplomacy is trying to navigate through. This is important. Well, the last part about Ukraine is, as you said from the beginning, what was the most important aspect of the Turkish drones in the Ukrainian defense against the Russian invasion? Well, yes, they are, like technically speaking, and this is 90% of my everyday job, like being a defense geek, they fly at 70 knots, and they do not use the manned aircraft. The frequencies of the electromagnetic spectrum that the manned aircraft generally use, so they make them really hard targets for the Russian air defenses. They are equipped with precision-guided munitions, so they can pinpoint strike any target of their choosing. The Soviet-Russian platforms are really vulnerable to top attack capability when you attack them in an angle exceeding going beyond 70 degrees or so. They are really vulnerable because of their design philosophy. But the most important thing of the Turkish drones for Ukraine, they were there in the beginning. When some other NATO nations were offering helmets to the Ukrainian military, we shouldn't forget that the Ukrainians, some Western think tanks were anticipating a 2 weeks victory for the Russian Federation. I read foreign policy pieces penned by really credible sources in DC saying that Western arms would not make a difference. And before the war, I read even better pieces saying that Russia will never invade Ukraine. They came out of this capital, including other NATO capitals. And at a time when some other nations were offering a right to Zelensky to evacuate capital Kyiv, and let's imagine how it would have played out if the Ukrainian government left Kyiv for Lviv. And when some other NATO nations were offering helmets and like medical supplies to Ukraine, Turkish drones were already operating there. And even before the war, they operated in Donbas, in the Eastern Front, with no limitations on their combat deployments.
And it was, as I understand, it wasn't just drones and other equipment. There were also joint training of commandos and things like that going on as
and
well.
more, Turkey does not certify foreign munitions to its drones. So it is the Turkish munitions or nothing.
Yeah.
Ukraine has never, like this is a hint and tip to, it is not revealed publicly, but the most important telltale indicator is like since the outset of the war, Ukraine has never ever faced an ammunition shortage as to the Turkish drones operations.
And there's an old saying in the U.S. normally applied to sports that the best ability is availability.
Exactly.
Great. Well, thank you for that, John. If I can turn back to you, Alper. So we've got these very interesting developments going on in Turkey and in their defense exports and so forth. But it's tricky because the old paradigm of U.S.-Turkish relations was so defense-centric. And we heard that from both General Jones and General Clark, I think, about the camaraderie and the families that had served in the other country on both sides. But is there a lack of connective tissue now that the U.S. troops have largely come out of Turkey? During the Cold War, that military to military was so crucial. Maybe in the future it'll be business. We've got a goal of $100 billion in bilateral trade that we're moving towards, but slowly. In the meantime, who carries the ball for bilateral relations? Who are the champions?
Well, Rich, that's a great question. But I mean, look at this conversation. Two very important aspects of Turkish-U.S. relations have come to the fore in a manner that I think is really missing in the debate, both in Turkey and in the United States. So I really welcome this opportunity and the conversation that we're having here. The two aspects are the legacy of the relationship. Both Jim Jones and Wesley Clark and Dove highlighted the importance of that with examples. And John particularly highlighted the potential in this new era, given where Turkey is, particularly in terms of its defense industry. But there's more to it than that. And if we're looking for a connective tissue between the two countries, the legacy is there, the potential is there. It's more about establishing and broadening this relationship. And I think that's where mindset matters. And that's where both Ankara and Washington, I believe, have been remiss in not investing enough in this relationship. The mill-to-mill contact will always continue to be important, particularly given the fact that we're talking increasingly of a world that is defined by competition, where geopolitics matter. Transatlantic security is not something that we can be complacent about. I believe, and Dove highlighted this, that was the assumption. It reminds me of the immediate aftermath of the end of the Cold War, where almost all of Turkey's European allies started immediately reaping the benefits of the peace dividend, whereas Turkey was not able to because of conflicts that arose in the Caucasus and then in the Balkans and then to Turkey's east. And now we're at a new era. Yes, there are new challenges on the horizon, but transatlantic security is not something that we can be complacent about, and Ukraine has been a blunt reminder. So overall, again, as was mentioned, geography does not change. Turkey is an important partner for the United States. And despite the discord between the two countries on a number of issues, something that the Turkish foreign minister alluded to when he was meeting Secretary Blinken yesterday in London, there is an underlying significant overlap of interest between the two countries. The tissue that can carry that forward has to be widespread, not only mill-to-mill contact, but I think the business community has a big potential in that regard. And again, when we look at the realities of the day, we're talking about nearshoring, friendshoring. We're talking about ensuring that Europe is less reliant, is de-risking in terms of its requirements. And that's where Turkey, as a big manufacturing hub in the civilian sector, can really play an important role also, for example, in Africa, in terms of offsetting the footprint of other rivals in today's world. So I think there's a huge potential, but what's really missing is that we're not talking about this. We're so focused on the negatives in the relationship, both in Ankara and in Turkey, and in Washington, D.C. And I think that's where first leadership matters, and second, we need to have other interest groups step into the fold and talk about the potential in the relationship.
Great, thank you. And if I can just follow up, Ambassador, with a question we got from the audience. You mentioned how important atmospherics and tone are to resetting bilateral relations. Here's a question on that point. It says, recently, Sea Defender 2023 exercise took place, led by Germany with many other NATO countries participating. Turkey responded only at the last minute and sent only medical, not combat vessels, causing a lot of eye rolling among other member states. Why do they insist on being the Joe Manchin of NATO?
That's a good example. And I guess Turkey could have done better in that regard. But that's not the only example to look at. Turkey sent in reserve troops to Kosovo, for example, where there was an immediate requirement. So I think when you look at it from one angle, Turkey can do more. When you look at it from another angle, there are areas where Turkey has been stepping up. And we spoke about Ukraine, for example, where, yes, other countries were very reluctant to even send any semblance of defense items, and Turkey was stepping up to the plate. So can Turkey do better? Yes. Is it not doing enough? Arguably so. But is it not doing anything? No, it is doing its part, I think, in many respects. Excellent.
Thank you. If I can just knock down, by relying on your experience here, Dov, another question we've got here. I think this is an interesting one from Mert Geyiktepe at Harvard College. The U.S.-Turkey relationship seems to have gained pace within the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as we discussed. But the recent deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran is likely to affect the nature of the relationship as well. Do you think this deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran is likely to encourage further strengthening of U.S.-Turkish ties? And do you expect concerns about Russia to be the focal point of defense ties, or developments in the Middle East to be more of a driver?
Well, Iran and Turkey have a history going back hundreds of years of clashing, quite frankly, fighting each other. Depends how far back you want to go. But I remember in 1981, as I said, when I was first there, I was at a reception. It was the first Iranian official that I ever met. It was the Iranian ambassador to Turkey at the time. And Turkey has been very careful about how it relates to Iran, for good reason. It's got enough on its plate. Yeah. The Saudi-Iranian arrangement, and other than exchanging ambassadors, let's see how far it really goes. I haven't noticed that the Saudis have told the Israelis, we don't need any defense cooperation with you anymore because we have a deal with Iran. That's just not the way it works. And remember, the Saudis had official diplomatic relations with Iran 7 years ago. It's only a 7-year hiatus, which in the Middle East is nothing, a second, as you well know. Yeah. So to me, the real issue is this. Turkey brings a lot more to the West than the West appreciated for about 20 years. Let me give you another example beyond 1981. Go forward 20 years. First time I come into Afghanistan. Now, I was coordinator for the Defense Department on the civilian side. I am met by a Turkish colonel at the airport. Turkey was alongside us in Afghanistan. Their construction industry was very heavily involved. They were able to move around because they had a star and crescent flag, which was not we had stars and stripes. That wasn't very popular in some places. Stars and crescents are a little easier. And then in 2003, of course, they wouldn't let the 4th Infantry Division go through Turkey because of the vote in the parliament. That soured relations. In many ways, that was beyond just the fact that I had mentioned earlier, the end of the Cold War. That actually soured relations. Big accelerator, yeah. But times really have changed. And one aspect that nobody's mentioned yet, look how Turkey has dealt with the Montreux Convention, okay? Because it wouldn't let Russian warships into the Black Sea, those warships in the Mediterranean have had to go all the way around to Vladivostok. Yeah. The other option was to just die on the vine in the Mediterranean. Those poor sailors have been stuck there. So that's another way that Turkey has been helpful to Ukraine, but not in, a super prominent way. Yeah. But what counts isn't the noise you make. What counts is what you're doing. And so if you look at what they're doing with Ukraine, you've heard about industrial cooperation, you've heard about the drones knocking out Russian weapons. Now I'm telling you about keeping Russian ships out, which could make a lot of trouble if they were allowed back in. You see that they're doing a lot. They're walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Right, great. John, you and I have talked a lot about Black Sea security, and we've got a question here from Deborah Kagan. At the council here, and I think this is sort of a good question about the relations in the Black Sea writ large, not just focusing on Ukraine. Here's the question. Turkey still gets almost 40% of its gas from Russia and gets paid to be the upstream provider for Turkstream. This puts Turkey in a difficult position vis-a-vis Russia. Meanwhile, both Turkey and Romania are actively developing and bringing online independent energy resources. Since Turkey and Romania are Black Sea allies and NATO members, what are the prospects for Turkey working more actively with Romania to ensure the safety and security of these offshore energy developments and to assist its NATO ally Romania, which is dealing with Russian threats and floating sea mines in the Black Sea and so forth?
That's a great one. Well, Turkey had two pillars of policymaking in the Black Sea. One is the Montreux Convention. Montreux Convention is carved in stone. It is there to stay. And this is something that most Western experts are trying to see through the prism of Turkish domestic policy, domestic politics, be it the President Erdogan's incumbent conservative government, be it the 1990s Turkey or any other government in the future, Turkey's Montreux policy will not change. But there was another pillar, and I think this is really not getting enough attention from the West, particularly from the United States, which is the regional ownership, like solving Black Sea matters within the Black Sea and among the Black Sea riparian littoral countries. That is gone. One cannot rejuvenate that. Nobody from Romania, from Ukraine, from Bulgaria will sit with the Russians in the same negotiations table and discuss Black Sea matters, because right now the Russian Black Sea fleet illegally is blockading Ukrainian trade activity. We should see the shape of the invasion, the battlefield geometry, we call it again among our Defense Geek talks with you. The Ukraine has been turned into de facto Mongolia right now. It lost its access to Sea of Azov, and its Black Sea window city, Odessa, is under an overwhelming pressure from the Russian Black Sea fleet. Yeah. So Ukraine and the Turkish diplomacy was able to prolong extend the grain deal for only 2 months last time it did, and only for grains. Yeah. Ukraine cannot trade through sea lines of communications freely in the Black Sea. So Turkish regional ownership policy, keeping what happens in the Black Sea stays in the Black Sea policy, is gone. It is dead. It is not coming back. What it can lead to, more than energy cooperation, and Turkish energy dependence on Russia is really a problematic issue. And if the West wants to address, the Turkish, let's say, relieving Turkey from its anchors to the Russian Federation, there are two things I would say. One is the energy dependence, and the other one is Syria, especially Idlib, and especially Russia's potential to exacerbate a more problematic, troublesome human wave from Idlib pouring into Turkey. Mm-hmm. But apart from that, I think NATO has an opportunity, like the NORDEFCO in the Scandinavian region. There is prospect for establishing a NATO within NATO between Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania, and potentially taking Ukraine and in the future Georgia maybe into that, and making sure that the Russians would not find a chair when the music stops. Yeah. It is really doable right now, because Turkish-Romanian relations and Turkish-Bulgarian relations are really good. And these countries are really open for defense cooperation and strategic cooperation with Turkey.
So this sort of minilateral approach within NATO would probably require both Brussels and the United States to help from behind?
Exactly.
And let Turkey lead. Is that likely?
One shouldn't confuse it with the strategic autonomy talks going on in the Parisian circles, especially after President Macron. That wouldn't, be a parallel structure, an alternative structure to NATO. That would be, a mini NATO within NATO, still depending on NATO Article 5 guarantees and not duplicating what NATO does. I think this is really important also to alleviate or to find the sweet spot between the Montreux restrictions and also demands from the United States and also other Black Sea NATO nations like Bulgaria and Romania. That is the second point. The third point is, apart from energy cooperation, there is a specific address, like a cortisone shot, that can give a true boost to the Turkish role in the Black Sea and supporting the Black Sea NATO nations. Look at the Turkish defense industry right now and look at what specific missile category Turkey is coming up with indigenous systems using indigenous engine packs. This is really important for exports control and, not making it an American issue, but a Turkish issue to decide. Coastal defenses. Missiles like Atmaca, Çakır, anti-ship missile industry is really doing well in Turkey. It is skyrocketing. They are really flexible weapon systems. Why I am bringing it to the table? Before the war erupted in Ukraine, had I written something like most probably the Ukrainians would sink the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, Moscow missile cruiser, who would believe what I have just written? Yeah. Ukraine practically does not have a navy. But the Moscow missile cruiser case showed that we always, I myself, I did 2 posts in the NATO research positions. We always tend to think anti-access area denial as the Russian magic wand that they would use against NATO, and it's going to paralyze us.
Cuts both ways.
But Moscow missile cruiser incident showed that the beast is not immune to its own venom. The Russians are not immune to anti-access area denial capabilities, and that bodes very well with the Black Sea. So I think especially Turkish coastal defense systems and unmanned surface vehicles, and also like unmanned aerial vehicles together, like A2AD components with the American help, because A2AD is really dependent on sensor fusion capabilities. Yeah. You cannot hit what you wouldn't detect.
Can't see.
Exactly. But that also creates an opportunity in the Black Sea, like fostering A2AD within that, mini NATO within NATO architecture. Excellent in the Black Sea.
Excellent points. Ambassador Coşkun, turning back to you, and I'm going to integrate a question that I had with one of the questions we've got here. This is not about the election outcome in Turkey, but its impact on foreign policy, specifically the strength of the nationalist movements as they came out. There were 2 very different visions, I think, for foreign policy. The opposition had made clear that they're going to sort of reset the Atlantic Alliance as a North Star for Turkish foreign policy. And I think the incumbents had sort of developed this multi-axial approach that's got a lot of balancing and hedging behaviors in it. Do you think that given the results with President Erdogan's reelection and with sort of the foreign policy team staying intact, is it going to be much more multi-axial and therefore a little harder to get reconvergence with Europe and the United States? That's part A. Part B is where do you see more likely progress earlier in this presidential term for President Erdogan in relations with Europe or relations with the U.S.? And the question we've got from Athens is reconvergence even possible as long as President Erdogan is there?
Yes. Actually, John's answer sort of alluded to the context in which we need to think about these things, in the sense that, yes, there's a lot of rhetorical discussion in Turkey. Is Turkey, totally embedded in the Western alliance? Is it mindset there, or is it looking elsewhere? And we talk about this because nowadays it's really out there as a debate and something that the Turkish administration, particularly President Erdogan and his government, has been voicing. But at the end of the day, when you look at Turkey overall, it's always been a part of a wider geography. It's always been embedded within NATO, but at the same time, it's been a part of the Middle East, of the Caucasus, of Central Asia, and so on. So I think we need to take a step back when trying to understand where Turkish foreign policy interests are. And though there was a disparity in the debate, as you alluded to, between the opposition and the incumbent government going into the elections, at the end of the day, I think the dynamics that and the multivectoral nature of Turkish foreign policy have always been more or less the same. It's the accents that have changed, and that's where I think Turkey can improve in ensuring that it gives a clearer message as to where its priorities are. When we look at Turkey today, and I don't think it would have mattered much if the opposition had been successful in the recent elections, Turkey's interests are more widespread. And this is a reality that is affecting not only Ankara, but I think many capitals across the world, particularly in what is referred to as the global south. But overall, even under President Erdogan, when push comes to shove, I think we've seen that he and his government values Turkey's role within NATO, in the sense that the deterrence that comes together with being a member of the alliance has been something that has helped Turkey develop even its relationship with the Russian Federation. having that in Turkey's pocket at the same time while trying to develop relations or at least maintain stable relations with Moscow has been an important element. And I think that that reality will continue to be a guiding element in Turkish foreign policy, which is why we need to expect seeming inconsistencies in Turkish foreign policy. And again, Ukraine's a great example. John gave that example as well. On the one hand, Turkey's buying the S-400. On the other hand, it's already been providing the drones to Ukraine and is contemplating co-production there. We will see these seeming inconsistencies increasingly, possibly, in Turkish foreign policy. And that is a new paradigm that we need to get used to in terms of Turkey and its foreign defense security policies. But at the end of the day, Turkey is a part of the Western security architecture. Remaining a solid member of that architecture is a force multiplier for Turkey in its relations, both in the Middle East and in its dealing with the Russian Federation. So I think that overall mindset will not change. And that brings me to the particular question under President Erdogan, what to expect in terms of relations with the West. I think, before the elections, President Erdogan also made the point that he's ready to sit down and talk with President Biden and to see where the two countries can find common interests. This will continue to be a guiding focus as far as Turkey is concerned. And again, the foreign minister has alluded to this as well. We'll see how it develops. And I think the initial signals coming out of Washington are positive as well. We heard the comments that Jake Sullivan made in terms of Turkey post-elections. Of course, there are continuing sore points. And, unless the two sides can take a step back from their ossified positions in two areas and find a reasonable way forward, we'll continue to have difficulties. These are one U.S.-Syria policy. And I don't have the answer to this question, but at the end of the day, it's important for the two sides to sit down and find a manageable way forward. And the second, I think, is the S-400 issue and the implications that it has brought in terms of defense industry cooperation between Turkey and the United States. Unless we can find some room for maneuver in these two areas that satisfy both sides in a way that we can at least manage these differences as we're trying to develop the relations in different venues, we will continue to face difficulties in the bilateral relationship. But currently, I think President Erdogan and President Biden are signaling that they're ready to work together, and there's a room for optimism in that respect.
Thank you, Alper. So, Dov, you're a canny, long-time advisor of Washington, sort of insider business, how policies get made. The remarks that Alper was referring to were kind of interesting in this regard. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, asked by Fareed Zakaria after the election, what do you expect? Is this going to get worse from Turkey? And he said, anti-Americanism has always been part of the electoral landscape in Turkey. Don't be too concerned about it. Turkey's a democracy. He used those words. He said, there's still lots of opportunity for improvement. So that raised some eyebrows, got people thinking, because that's not the characterization that we've heard in Washington for the last couple of years about Turkey. That seems to be a signal of, okay, we are ready to seek a convergence. But of course, in our system of government, the executive branch has its views and Congress has its views. How reconcilable are the two? And if there were a desire at the top levels in the executive branch to seek a better equilibrium in the relationship, do you think that the executive branch currently has the wasta with the Congress to make that happen?
Well, the biggest obstacle, as everybody knows, is not Congress, but the Senate, and the biggest obstacle in the Senate is the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. Mr. Biden ought to know about that. He was chairman at one point. Look, it's not going to be simple. Senator Menendez has a lot of support in communities that are not particularly friendly to Turkey. But that would be the way to break the logjam. Now, how much pressure has been put on Senator Menendez up to now? Really not very much. But there have been hints, pretty strong hints, that the United States is ready to sell F-35s to Turkey.
16s?
F-16B.
Well, 16Bs and then F-35 cooperation, right? And so the question now is, can the White House, can the administration start to push Senator Menendez on this and say, look, we need the Turks with us. And by the way, the point's been made, U.S. and Europe and Turkey, not the same. Yeah. Remember, Turkey has tried to become a member of the European Union, which was then the European Economic Community, since 1965. That's a long time ago. Even I was young then. And so you're getting Europe to agree to Turkey to come in, I think, is kind of rough. Getting Europe to have a positive attitude to Turkey, particularly France, Germany, kind of rough as well. I think Sweden will come into NATO. I think Mr. Erdogan won't do it before Vilnius, but I think he might after Vilnius. But that is NATO. It's not the European Union. So when you talk about relations with the West, primarily you mean the United States. And so that logjam that the ambassador just talked about has to be broken. Yeah. And the only way it's going to be broken, the only way they'll get their 16Bs, the only way they might get a piece still, if possible, of the F-35 deal, and maybe F-35s eventually, because other nations in NATO are getting them. The only way that'll happen is if Mr. Menendez changes his position. One could argue that given what's going on in the Black Sea, in Ukraine, in the region, that there is a very strong case for saying, look, we know there may be issues, even with the S-400. I think there could be a deal on the S-400 as well. There have been all kinds of proposals to deal with that. So it's going to have to be a change, not just on the part of Turkey, not just on the part of the administration. I think the administration has changed. Yeah. And I think Turkey is ready to talk. That's clear. So we're talking about perhaps only one senator.
Yeah. Great. John, there's an opening here on the S-400. There's been some interesting statements out of Turkish defense industrial sectors about S-400 and about the developments of other options and how critical the S-400 really is. Do you see a path forward from the Turkish perspective on how S-400s cease to be an issue in the bilateral?
Well, actually, I'm going to quote the new chief of Turkish procurement here, Haluk Görgün, who openly told that Turkey would not need S-400s anymore. With the achievements Turkey has registered in the air defense segment, especially when the new system like Hisar and Siper, when they can hit in the test what we call high altitude, long range, realm of threats. Turkey practically does not need S-400. That I agree with. Why? Again, going into the details of defense business, what you would do with the S-400? You would do air defense and limited missile defense. It would be a standalone system, which means that you wouldn't connect it to the Turkish air and missile defense architecture. You cannot connect it with the Turkey's radar outlook that is compatible with NATO or NATO systems themselves. You would not be able to connect it with the Turkish combat air patrols, which is the cool way of saying Turkish aircraft flying and patrolling over the Turkish airspace. So it cannot see what an F-16 can see, unlike the Patriots, for instance. So practically, these are all the prerequisites, like a network-centric architecture is the very prerequisite for ballistic missile defense. What you could do with the S-400 is, in a standalone fashion, is using it as a standalone air defense system, especially to complement, the fighter aircraft if they are having a trouble with one sector. And given that Turkish fighter aircraft arsenal is huge, but it is aging, the F-16s we are talking about. But with the indigenous solutions right now, I agree with and this is really fundamental, by the way, the outgoing president of the Turkish procurement body, SSB, which is under CAATSA sanctions right now, legally, and in turn, not only the person, the outgoing chief, but also the institution itself. It is really, going into the opposite direction that before assuming the office, Haluk Görgün told that, Turkey wouldn't need that. Can we have a way out from this debacle of the F-16Vs and the S-400s? Well, first of all, F-16V deal, I completely agree with what you said, but the F-16V deal is important to Turkey as it is important to the United States, and we should understand that. It is important to Turkey. Why? Because Turkish Air Force has a generational problem right now. We are flying with the 4th generation F-16s at a time when the world is shifting to the 5th generation aircraft like F-35. And at a time when the world is shifting the day after in the 2040s to the sixth generation aircraft, like the British, Swedish, and the Italian Tempest project. So we need that as a stopgap up until the Turkish defense industries come up with Khan, Turkish fifth generation indigenous aircraft. But from the American side of the things, the F-16 is the last anchor that US arms producers like General Dynamics and Lockheed Martin would have a share in the Turkish defense market. And Turkish defense market is one of the largest defense markets in Europe. What are you going to sell Turkey in 2030s? Let's talk about defense business, which is really technical and away from, day-to-day politics and headlines. Abrams main battle tanks, you cannot. Turkey going to come up with its own main battle tank. Artillery, Turkish artillery capabilities are stunning right now. They are doing really well. What are you going to say? Armored personnel carriers, like infantry fighting vehicles. The land warfare systems is the exact segment that the Turkish defense producers are enjoying most freedom and indigenous subsystems. Choppers, what are you going to say? Like tactical ballistic missiles, ATACMS. The Turkish defense industry is coming up with all these, or drones. The F-16 established the real military-to-military relation between United States and Turkey. This is a special platform. And the F-16V deal would be actually a continuation of the US stake in Turkish defense market. If it doesn't happen, what is next? Turkey would look for a stopgap. There are two stopgaps in Europe, technically speaking. One is the Swedish offer. Swedish offer is a non-starter because the engine is American, and second, the Swedish would never ever, after the NATO discussions and the showdown, never ever agree to sell it. The other one is Eurofighter Typhoons. The Brits are retiring them. There are two problems with Eurofighter Typhoons. First, too many chefs kill the soup. And there is the German contribution to that. I'm not sure the Germans would be eager to sell Eurofighter Typhoons to Turkey. Second thing, assuming an ideal world, Turkey procures the Eurofighter Typhoons, still it's going to save the day. It's going to be a stopgap, but it would not help Turkey to ascend to fifth generation military aviation for its air force. Turkey will need to wait for its own indigenous solution. So the F-16V is take it or break it point for the United States as well. It is Lockheed Martin's signature in the Turkish defense market, likewise General Dynamics, and it creates intercompatibility between the American and Turkish Air Force. Like Turkish Air Force flying with an American solution is something for the United States in NATO's southern flank. So it is about that. Can Turkey get rid of the S-400s? Will Turkey want to get rid of the S-400s? That's, again, the money question. That's the million-dollar question. Unfortunately, there is no re-export license granted by the Russians. And the National Defense Authorization Act's wording is very clear here. Turkey had an opportunity to create a model, like the Greeks are operating their S-300s, but that ship has sailed after the recent NDAA.
Okay, great. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Alper, if I can touch on the issue that Dov identified about Turkey's relations with the West being differentiated between the US and Europe. It really is two different things. Can you talk to us a little bit about relations with Europe? It's not all one speed, I think, right? Turkey has some countries in Europe that are a little bit more inclined towards cooperation. United Kingdom comes to mind. We've talked about Ukraine already, which is European and not European. There's Albania, which has a very special relationship. From a Turkish perspective, what are the bright spots in European relations and what are the real challenges? I think you may be muted. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yes, more challenges than bright spots, I have to say, particularly in terms of Turkey's relations with the European Union. But I just want to take a step back. This distinction when looking at Turkish foreign policy and its relations with the West, Turkey's engagement with the United States and with Europe and the European Union, they're not either ors, obviously. There's a lot of complementarity between the two. So I think it's important to look at it in a more broader perspective. But when it comes to Europe, the prism of Turkey's European Union membership that is really at a standstill right now has been the dominant feature. I don't see any progress in the short run in that regard, but particularly in terms of dealing with challenges such as migration, climate issues. There are areas, and even energy. There are areas of potential cooperation between Turkey and the European Union, also individually with European Union countries. And that comes to your question. Turkey does have, a different array of deepening relations with various EU countries. Traditionally, the Southern Rim, Spain and Italy particularly, have been countries with whom Turkey has had more closer relations. But overall, I think Turkey's relationship with the European Union is going through a difficult period. And the perspective of Turkey on the part of the European Union as a country that is almost a migrant basket, I think, is a non-starter for Turkey. And that is an area where Turkey and the European Union need to develop a more positive agenda. And that's where I think President Erdogan will be looking also to the United States for support in terms of finding some sort of a solution to the challenge that has become increasingly a big burden for Turkey in terms of dealing with the migrants in Turkey, particularly the Syrians, which is where, again, a very contentious issue, but mending fences with Damascus, as far as Ankara is concerned, is an important issue. And then the repatriation of the Syrians in Turkey, the funding aspect of that will all be issues that Turkey will be debating with the European Union, particularly in the days to come.
Excellent. Thank you. I think we've got time for about one more. And since we are a defense journal, John, I want to direct this to you with sort of a defense, a very military focus. The Turkish military, as assessed by the West over the last 5 or 6 years, is dichotomous, because you heard many criticisms saying, well, all the best guys were driven out after the coup or before the coup, and that they're politicized, and that they're not. But the reality is that they've become more combat tested, more deployable. The military, as well as other security services, have had effects and operations in North Africa, in the Caucasus, helping Ukraine and so forth. How should a Western audience understand the Turkish military? Is it more professional, less professional? They have fewer conscripts now, shorter conscription, more contract NCOs. But how do you view this as someone who's watched it since you were very small?
Well, I always have my problems with the headlines and day-to-day politic talk. So let's look at the facts, like the military and geopolitical facts. After the war in Ukraine, we're going to have 3 really large militaries in Europe. They will rank the first, second, and the third: Poland, Turkey, and Ukraine. That is a major, change in the European defense architecture. The good old times when the French and the Germans and the Brits dominated the entire European defense realm, that is again gone. So there will be a new reality. Of those 3 nations, 2 are coming with real warfighting experience. One is Turkey, one is Ukraine, and one is a NATO nation, which is Turkey. So again, the idea of a political NATO, this is the title of a report published by NATO Defense College before the Ukraine war erupted, by the way. Go read that. I completely disagree with the article. And the Ukraine war disagreed with the article, but definitely go read that article in order to understand the mindset. It argues turning NATO into some kind of European Union. And it says, the benchmark for being the cool guy in the town in NATO circles should be the answer to the question how liberal your democracy is. Okay? The Ukraine war reminded us that Ukraine war is actually genetic therapy for NATO. It dragged NATO back to its DNA more than anything happened in the 21st century. NATO is a military alliance. And the problem with NATO is that most of our allies do not have real militaries. And the bigger problem is that most of those allies do not want to have real militaries. Yeah. I'm going to talk with numbers. There are only 2 NATO nations that outman Russian Western military district. Not the Russian entire armed forces, Russian Western military district. United States and Turkey. 2/3 of the alliance lack manpower to outman Russian VDV, the airborne forces. Okay? Right after the coup, Turkey launched Operation Euphrates Shield, 2016, and it became the first nation and the only nation that put boots on the ground, conventional warfighting formations against ISIS. It happened, weeks after the coup attempt. So that speaks for itself. Turkish military is a real warfighting one. The Turkish defense industry is backing that. Was that important before the war in Ukraine? It was, but not that much. But after the war in Ukraine, where the political NATO ideas are, are not existing or not relevant anymore. And again, like in the good old Cold War days, to be the cool guy in the town in NATO circles, the question you have to answer is how many combat-capable divisions and brigades you can bring to the table.
Yeah.
After the United States, Turkey is a rock star.
Wasn't it Stalin who said, how many battalions does the Pope have?
Yeah,
Well, I've been talking mostly policy and attitude, so I want to build on some of the military stuff since I've kind of dealt with that for a long time. It's troops, boots on the ground means a lot. It's a general term, but it means that you've got logistics that work. It means you've got communications that work. It means that you've got morale in the troops. So what Turkey has is operational experience. When you go through a NATO exercise, too many of them are rehearsed.
Yeah.
Okay? When you're dealing with real live fire directed at you, that's a very different experience.
Different learning curve. Yeah.
It's a totally different learning curve, and Turkey has moved up that learning curve because of the multiple operations it's had in the region. That is critical, precisely as you said, because when you look at post-Ukraine, you want to look at countries whose militaries are professional, not necessarily only not being conscript, but professional in the sense that they've got the experience on the ground in all the many ways that warfighting really calls for.
Outstanding. I think we're just about out of time. Alper, I'm going to turn to you for last licks to be equitable in our distribution of time here. So finish us off with something sophisticated and brilliant.
That's a hell of a way to set me up here. I'll try and capstone what was just said with a very brief political observation, in the sense that, given the characteristics of Turkey, as both John and Dov referred to, I think for Turkey's allies, when they look at regional security and transatlantic security overall, rather than looking to hedge their interests with alternatives to Turkey, it's important to continue to look at Turkey as a partner, but to think with a new state of mind. Turkey will not fall in line as it maybe used to in the past. It has other priorities. These will not always overlap either with Washington or with Brussels overall, to speak of the European Union in this context. But that is a small proportion of the overall reality, which is, I think, the overlapping set of interests between Turkey and its Western allies are significant. But there's homework for Turkey as well. Turkey needs to make sure that it is not confusing its allies and partners. It's understandable that it wants a stable relationship with Russia. It's understandable that it does not want to have a confrontation with China, for example, but at the same time, it should confirm its solid position as a bedrock member of the Western alliance, and that's where I think Turkey can do better. So if both sides own up to these realities in a more responsible manner, I think there's room for optimism, but there's a lot of work to be done on both sides. I'll end it with that. Not brilliant, but the best I can do, Rich.
It was pretty good. It was pretty good. Well, look, on behalf of Defne Arslan and the Turkey program and the Atlantic Council in Turkey, I'm deeply grateful for the participation of our guests today, including Dov Zakheim, Can Kasapoglu, and Alper Coşkun. Very glad also to have had Generals Jones and Clark join us. We're also very thankful to the audience for your participation and for all the great questions. So thank you very much, and keep reading those issues. There'll be another one in 3 months.